were 215 children's remains discovered at a former Canadian residential school. On May 27, 2021, the Kamloops Indian Band announced that ground-penetrating radar had detected the remains of 215 children at the site of a former residential school. The media quickly picked up the story, with headlines proclaiming the discovery of mass graves. Social media exploded, churches were vandalized, and some burned to the ground. Catholic bishops issued apologies. But was it true? I sat down with Father Cristino Bouvette, a Catholic priest with Indigenous heritage, and asked him a number of questions surrounding this report and the consequences of it. Our discussion attempts to bring clarity to this controversy. Father Cristino, this has been a long time coming. I'm so pleased that we get to do this again.
Me too.
Welcome. So,
Thank you.
Today, there's been a topic that I've been meaning to talk to you about, and it starts with the number 215. Mm-hmm. And the number 215 has been circulating particularly within the Canadian Church because of a report of grave sites found in the Kamloops area near a residential school. And the initial claim on May 27th, 2021, the Kamloops Indian Band issued a statement that said, this past weekend, with the help of a ground-penetrating radar specialist, the stark truth of the preliminary findings came to light. The confirmation of the remains of 215 children who were students of the Kamloops Indian Residential School. So this is back in 2021. Mm-hmm. You remember that?
Oh, how could I forget?
So what was your first reaction?
When I first saw the story break, I had been away on retreat. And so I had my phone off and I wasn't going on the internet. When I turned my phone on, it exploded with texts and emails, and then I read this headline, and the headline used the word a mass grave, that a mass grave had been discovered at the site of a former residential school. Well, you can imagine. I think you're aware, maybe some of your audience would not be aware, that I have Indigenous heritage. My grandmother, who is Cree Indian, she spent 12 years in a residential school. She received her entire education in that system, along with all of her siblings. So this is not something that I am unfamiliar with. This is something that hits very close to home for me. When I saw that headline, my heart just sank. And as I continued to read the story, I said, wait a minute, what do you mean you've discovered a mass grave? It was sort of like the mass grave was the title, and then there started to be these other peculiarities to the way that they were describing what happened, that there was the use of ground-penetrating radar,
right,
and the remains were found, but nothing had been dug up. And as I read through, I said, this doesn't sound like this has confirmed. This sounds like we are afraid that this might be what's here. So my next logical conclusion was, well, then I guess we're going to need to, as carefully and respectfully as possible, excavate the site so that if there are, in fact, bodies, remains of children that are just heaped up in some grave, that we can do whatever it takes to make sure that they have been properly dealt with, but then also start asking some questions. What the heck happened here?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Well, that's not what ever came to pass. It seemed as though this statement was going to suffice to send the entire country into a tailspin of remorse and hatred and vitriol and anger that it left my head spinning. I couldn't believe what was happening. Many people know about my own personal cultural background and my family's association with residential schools. Now I'm a Catholic priest, and the Catholics were enemy number one. The federal government sure made that easy to identify quickly and early on, that these were operated primarily by Catholics, the Catholic Church. And so people wanted to know what I thought. And I didn't know what I thought. And unlike most people, I think, in our modern social media, instant messaging world, I just kept my mouth shut for a while. I needed time to process and to do more digging and ask some questions. And it didn't take long. It was less than a week before the phrase mass grave, discovery of mass grave, had been modified. And now I saw that we moved to the category was probable burial sites.
Very different.
And then they talked about graves. Well, graves are different than a pit full of bodies. Cemeteries are full of graves. So then I asked the question, are we talking about a cemetery? Is that what we found here? And of course, the more questions you start asking, not out of a sense of wanting to deny history. This is something that I feel very confident that I can stand in the face of, this whole concept of residential school denialism. How can I deny what my grandmother lived through? Who can accuse me of denying that? Asking questions isn't denying anything. Because if we are not seeking the truth, if we are not trying to understand all of what surrounds what's happened here, we will never get anywhere. What's the point of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission if we leave the truth off? You can't have reconciliation without truth. And so I am not opposed to reconciliation. I have spent the last 4 years of my life and ministry completely consumed by this question. But it has to have the truth.
So let's talk about the truth of the consequence of that initial report as reported as the remains of 215 children. What was the effect of that, if you think, on the country and on the church and on individuals? Like, it was massive.
We flew our flags at half-mast by federal decree for 6 months. There were protests held all over the place. The orange t-shirt campaign became a thing, and with this logo, Every Child Matters, and 215 printed everywhere, as though 215 was now symbolic of making amends for or reparation for these children who apparently perished while they were at residential school. It just became a life of its own.
What about even your thoughts then? Wasn't it after that we really started to see churches burn in Canada?
Well, that would be the biggest thing that you could say seemed like the consequence of this. I'm always careful to say that it's the precipitating cause, like that violence and aggression against Catholic churches wouldn't have happened if this story hadn't run. But it's hard to look away from the correlation between the two. Our churches weren't burning every other day of the week in the years leading up to this report. And then there was a period of time, what ended up happening with me was I delivered a sermon during Mass on June the 13th in which I tried to address this topic. It was widely circulated. It went on Facebook, and I think I didn't suffer any personal repercussions from any direction for saying the things that I said. But it was picked up by the news media, and then I was asked by Global News Calgary if I would be willing to help them put a little story together covering an Indigenous Catholic priest giving his take on what happened. And so the day they came to interview me, that beautiful, historic church in Morinville was burning to the ground. And the news anchor, the journalist who was going to interview me, asked me, how did I feel that day? Like, how did I feel about the interview that we were about to do? And I just said, I hope tomorrow my cathedral isn't burnt down. And I actually really wondered, if I go out on the news and I say the things, if I speak my truth, as we like to say nowadays, was I going to turn around and see my parish or my cathedral church burned to the ground? So this, we lost complete control of ourselves. We abandoned the use of reason. It was purely an emotional reaction to something that, if it were true, would certainly give good cause for having the emotions that were being expressed. But we weren't allowed to ask if it was true. And if you asked if it was true, that was another reason to cause outrage. We can't get anywhere in a situation like that.
When I look at this situation, too, before we get to what is the official story now, right after that, I saw church leaders respond, our bishops. Western Canada, I know the president of the Canadian Conference of Bishops also issued a statement, but there was a real unity in the message of either accepting for fact the 215 remains of children or accepting the fact of graves. So when the Catholic faithful heard their shepherds apologize for something that was considered fact, and it turns out it wasn't, but fact at the time, it was just people in the pews, in my perspective, experiences this shame based upon a falsehood. Do you think my assessment of that is correct?
I agree that that was the outcome. Many people did have that emotional reaction. Our bishops never apologized for the historic fact that 215 children were murdered and thrown into a pit. Okay, that was the way the initial story was spun and was put out. Our bishops never apologized for that. And what we seem as a culture, in general, incapable of doing now, are making distinctions. There are things to apologize for on behalf of the institution of the Catholic Church with regard to residential school. That is a fact. Children died in the residential school. That is a fact. There are burial sites at residential school property. That is a fact. You cannot weave together from out of those facts an imaginary scenario where priests and nuns are responsible for the execution of children who they have tried to systematically hide their deaths and bury them unceremoniously. If that's what you're trying to suggest has happened, and that is what needs to be apologized for, that is insane. That can't be apologized for because that's not what's happened. And if you take those other three categories that I just said were facts and try and weave a different story from out of them, then you are going to create a bigger falsehood. And when you've created a bigger falsehood and it inevitably unravels, it undermines everything that can be apologized for. So now we're experiencing a reversion where people who might say, let's say Catholics sitting in the pews, who felt forced into feeling ashamed under false pretenses, that now they just roll their eyes at the thought that the Catholic Church has to do anything about Indigenous reconciliation because it's all just baloney. That's not true. It isn't just baloney. There are things that we can and must be doing. But if you give any credence to the falsehood, you are going to undermine the good that you have been doing and could be doing. And that's the tightrope that I think continues to be walked. Yeah.
See, I feel like when the bishops apologize for something, accepting it as fact, maybe that's the best they knew at the time. Whether or not they should have, maybe was there another prudent way? What it was done as it was. My question is, there's still, and I'm sure of this, hundreds, if not thousands, of Catholics who still get the narrative wrong, and there has been no correction, as far as I know. When a bishop has said, "We apologize for the remains of 215 children." They haven't gone back to their diocese and said, oh, you know what? That wasn't 100% true. And I think that's an injustice.
I think what we have to, again, distinguish between is what are you apologizing for? This story that blew up about the discovery of 215 children's remains was the precipitating cause. It's what re-exposed this wound in our country's history about the background story of residential school system, period. And that there was the desire to apologize that this has had the profound impact that it has in our history isn't a bad thing, because apologies were already issued. Apologies aren't new. And this is the problem, was that this was being treated like nothing has ever been done about this before.
I agree.
When this broke, we had spent 30 years in the church in Canada working on addressing the outcomes from over time that we slowly grappled with and coming to be aware of that had impacted Indigenous communities. So this wasn't new, but it was reproposed to the public consciousness. Unfortunately, it was reproposed by way of something that was said to be a fact without any substantiating evidence. So what were the bishops apologizing for? They were apologizing for the history that we've already apologized for, that as it comes back to the surface with full force again, they again say, we acknowledge this part of our history, this participation in this system, as something regrettable. But it's easy to just become associated with the precipitating cause. And that's what I think people were not able to differentiate between. And if a bishop were to step forward at the moment when they've said that they regret the residential school legacy, and then call into question the graves when they don't even know anything about the graves, because no one knew anything about the graves, because nothing was being said except that they were there, then they're left standing in the middle, waiting for evidence to come down on them, either propping up what they've said or making them look like they are aloof and insensitive and uncaring, and that their apology is insincere.
But now we know different.
And I grant that. I grant that. I won't say that we know different. I will say that we still know as little as we always have. And now language is being adjusted that would suggest maybe we shouldn't have said what we said in the first place. I'm not sure if you're aware, but the Kamloops Band,
yes,
on the anniversary this year of that initial statement, has significantly adjusted the way they describe what, in fact, was discovered.
Yeah, I read that in the National Post, which is wonderful to see. So let's go back to that. We still don't know then 100% for sure, because they describe these, what was considered remains of children, then graves or unmarked graves. Now there are anomalies. That's what the official statement is, anomalies. We still don't know then exactly what those anomalies are, because have they done any excavations?
No, they have not. And the bottom line is this grave site is in an apple orchard. And we have surveyed maps that show that in the 1920s, a septic field was dug up and installed there. So there's a number of things that could be anomalies below the surface of the earth in an apple orchard where there's a septic field. Right. So to say that we've discovered these anomalies is a completely moot point. Who cares about a story where in an apple orchard you had ground penetrating radar discover that there might be some tree roots underneath the surface? Go figure. There's no story there. And so the difficulty is that the adjustment in language is not a correction of anything except an admission of what should have been said in the first place, if anything needed to be said at all. That's the question that I think we need to be asking. Did anything need to be said? What was there to say? And if there was a legitimate concern that ground penetrating radar has uncovered 215 anomalies, well then dig up one of them and see what you find.
And isn't it true within, I know Saskatchewan and Alberta, there's many grave sites that have been not kept, not even associated with residential schools. I just know where I grew up, just because the community doesn't have the money to look after the graves, and then people things start growing over and you forget where things are. It's not ideal, but these things happen. So isn't it entirely possible that it could be a grave site near the residential school? Because we do know that First Nation Indigenous children died from communicable diseases and at a higher rate than the rest of the population at the time. I think I'm correct in saying that. That's correct. And so it was necessary to have graves near some of these schools. Am I wrong in saying that?
Well, wherever people live, you're going to have a cemetery, because wherever people live, they will die. Life and death. This is not something that was a unique dynamic. Anywhere you went to boarding school, anywhere. This is something else that, again, when we're talking about distinctions, we've talked about this category, residential school, as if it was something so unique to the Canadian experience. Residential school was boarding school, and Canada was filled with other boarding schools that were modeled after the boarding schools all throughout Europe, which is where you went to live and go to school away from your family, and almost always it was because you were sent there by your family. What was unique in the residential school system was the intentional and hoped for outcome of systematically imposing assimilation. That we just can't have all of these people be their own unique different thing and expect to have a unified country. Well, we know we want a unified country, so we got to get everyone on the same page. That was the modus operandi of the residential school system in this country. And that is the tragedy that the Catholic Church, I don't want to say unwittingly, but perhaps unreflectively went along with, because it's contrary to how Catholic religious have delivered education in most of the rest of the world, anywhere else that they've ever gone. Preserving your language, teaching your language, raising you up in your culture, that's exactly what Catholic education has always sought to deliver. There was a different expectation from the government-run and imposed educational institutions in this country that were meant to be populated by Indigenous children. They had a different intended outcome than just providing education. And we participated in that. So was it entirely and exclusively bad? No. And the reason I can say that is because there are Indigenous people who will say, I am grateful for my education. I enjoyed my time in the residential school. And that is a truth. And so to refuse those people the ability to say that, to deny that they should get to have a voice because it doesn't fall in line with what we've decided is the only acceptable truth of that history, that is another injustice against those people who suffered in whatever other way they suffered while they were there. So this has to be, we have to start having rational conversations around the history and not just impose a predetermined version of history on everyone's consciousness, including Indigenous peoples, and say, if you don't get on board with this way of seeing that part of our history, then you're an evil person.
Mm-hmm. I think what you have just articulated so well, even mentioning that there was actually some Indigenous people that had a positive, were grateful for some aspects of their experience. People don't know. I don't think the average person within Canada knows that.
No.
Because of the inflammatory language in the mainstream media that even I remember watching like just commercials sometimes would tie into the Tim Hortons had a commercial regarding 215. The number was in there, and all of this just reinforces that initial story of mass graves. Mm-hmm. And as soon as you say mass graves, your mind goes to a big pit, a bunch of bodies dumped in, something that might happen in the First World War or Rwanda genocide. But this is not what we're talking about. I really want to make sure we get this. Like this didn't happen in Canada.
Yeah. We don't have evidence to show that it did. I can't say that it didn't happen. I can say we don't have evidence to suggest that it did. You cannot say something and not have the evidence to prove it. That's not how society functions. You don't just get to say something and now it's true because I said it. So I will not say that the opposite is therefore true. That's faulty logic, that you can't arrive at that conclusion. The opposite is not automatically true in the absence of evidence. But in the absence of evidence, you have nothing to stand on in suggesting that what you've just claimed is true. And that's what is problematic about how this has been handled. This was stated without any sufficient evidence. It was accepted to be true. If you suggested that it wasn't, you were condemned and excommunicated from polite society, and you were not allowed to ask questions or talk about it. What is that? That is not how society functions. Now, if someone else can come along and say, I have the evidence to show that none of this ever happened, I would be equally interested to see their evidence. How can you prove that something didn't happen?
Why would we assume that it did?
And that's exactly the point.
Well, then I feel like that we should be able to say it didn't happen.
Yeah, you can say that, but I think it's better said with as much clarity as possible, which is to say, we know that children died while they were at these schools. We have no reason to believe that their deaths were the consequence of some kind of foul play, or that it was being systematically and secretly hidden and covered up by the perpetrators of their murder. We have no reason to believe any of that. Well, if you have no reason to believe it, then you just don't say it. That's what I'm trying to get at. It's not, the burden of proof is not on the rest of Canada to prove that it never happened.
Well, except that many people do believe it did happen, so therefore I think it would be necessary to say it didn't. If thousands of people weren't saying that it didn't happen, well then, yeah, okay, we don't have to address it. But because many people believe that narrative, I think it serves a point of justice to say, no, where's the evidence to clearly say there is no mass graves in Canada? Like, why can't we say that?
You can say that.
I think we should.
With the understanding that you could be proven wrong. If they go along and they dig up some spot and they find a pit full of bodies, well then guess what? There's a mass grave in Canada. So my point is, when you don't know, don't speak. That should just be our general principle. If you don't know something, then why are you talking about it? So if I have not stumbled upon a mass grave, if you have not stumbled upon a mass grave, if the Kamloops Band didn't, and now themselves are saying, by adjusting their language, that they didn't, well, why are we talking about mass graves? They don't exist. They don't exist not because they might not exist, but because we don't have evidence to suggest that they do. I'm a big believer in being clear in our speech and saying only what we know we can say, or at least acknowledging where we just do not know, where there is uncertainty. When you know that in this institution, children died here, I don't think it's helpful to say, but I'll tell you what didn't happen, and then start speculating or taking for proof or taking for truth things that you don't have proof of. We know that children died in the residential schools, and in some cases at an alarming rate compared to the rest of society. And there's many societal reasons why that happened. There are many shortfalls to the way in which those schools were built, operated, and provided for that led to those outcomes. I'm not going to say that at not any one single one of those places, children were not buried in a mass grave. They may well have been.
I think what people, and maybe I'm wrong with this, when we use that language, mass grave, they're not just simply thinking a bunch of people were buried together. I think what is associated is intentional killing of people and dumping them
Precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely. And that's why when I was first approached by the media to see if I wanted to contribute to the story, I said, you are responsible for using this reprehensible category in your earliest reportage. And you have to address that. And I was told, well, we don't say that anymore. We don't say mass grave. Great. But for 2 weeks, that's the only thing that anyone heard. And now how do we reel that back in? I was sitting around with a group of people at a post-secondary institution where I do some ministry. And these are high-level administrators in an institution who were flabbergasted to hear me say, I don't think there's 215 children in that grave. They couldn't believe it because to them, I'm Mr. Indigenous Catholic priest, so of course. And they said, how can you say that? I said, well, how can you say that there are? Nothing has been done to discover whether or not that is the case except ground-penetrating radar that is incapable of identifying what it's seeing beneath the surface. So how can you just accept that that's what's been found there? And the one guy's answer to me was, what do you mean they didn't dig them up? I said, they've never dug up anything. Well, then how did they know it was 215? Good question. And he was speechless. He just didn't know what to do. Why? Because when you hear that catchy category, you don't ask any more questions. Mm-hmm. I'm just cautious about participating in that same behavior from the other side. You cannot promote ambiguity or making universal statements on either side if you don't know what you're talking about. So just be careful about the statements that you make.
So where do we go from here? We talk a lot about truth, healing, and reconciliation. Mm-hmm. You're in the circles of this, right? This is part of your ministry. What's next?
Well, I'll only say where I think we in the Catholic Church go from here. I'm not going to comment on what the federal government needs to do, what any particular Indigenous band and council, chief and council need to do. I will say, as a Catholic priest who has invested an immense amount of my time and effort and energy in the last number of years towards this work, that we are going to keep doing what we've been doing all along, which is honoring and respecting all of our Indigenous brothers and sisters, that we are going to continue to provide the pastoral care that they ask for, that we are going to work towards building up a culture of friendship among our people, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, not letting there be this big line drawn between how we do ministry in our diocese. So this is Indigenous ministry and this is non-Indigenous ministry, but just treating people like they belong. In my parish here now, where I'm stationed in Strathmore, we're very close to the Siksika First Nation. I see lots of people come and go in either direction. That's how it ought to be, that we just live among each other as harmoniously as we can. And the Catholic Church has a unique capacity to promote that. That's what we should be doing. And that's what we already are doing. And what I know our bishops are committed to continuing to do. And what I know I'm personally going to continue to be doing. I don't need to get caught up in things that pertain specifically to the history of the residential school system and just always be having my head looking backwards at the past when I could be focusing on how am I as a shepherd going to keep trying to help move people forward into a future.
So can I ask your thoughts then on regarding moving people forward in the future, your thoughts on participating in the orange shirt experience day and using slogans like "Every Child Matters," considering that they were directly inspired after the Kamloops initial report. If I think I'm right on that, yeah. But we now know there's there are anomalies. as that's what we know now. So what's your thought then on participating in that, and would you participate in Orange Shirt Day?
I have an orange t-shirt that was given to me as a gift that I love, and it has on it in black an emblazoned image of Our Lady of Guadalupe. And if you want me to participate in an Orange T-shirt Day event, I'm happy to do so. But that's the orange t-shirt that I'm going to wear. And if I am then accused of not doing the orange t-shirt thing in the right way, well, then I have to ask the question, well, what's this orange t-shirt thing about at all? Is it meant to be showing solidarity with Indigenous people? Okay, well, I'm an Indigenous person who put on an orange t-shirt, so what else do you want from me? But does it have to say 215 on it? Does it have to mean that I am affirming that this thing is actually true and has actually happened and is what we are lamenting? If that's the case, then I don't participate in that. And I won't. So we have to make distinctions, as always, between what is expected and what is being delivered. So if I am being asked to show solidarity with a cause, if as long as it's a cause that I can get behind, happy to show solidarity. And I'm very happy to show solidarity with the cause of promoting Indigenous reconciliation, Indigenous culture, and showing my not only openness, but my love for that, because it's part of who I am. If what's expected of me is that I'm participating in some kind of politically motivated campaign that affirms things to be true that we don't even have any evidence of, well, I'm not participating in that. And if that means that now I'm on the wrong side, so be it. But what I find very disingenuous about all of these campaigns is I don't know who comes up with them, but now they're the masters of what it means to be part of it. And if you don't fall exactly into line with what it is supposed to mean, well, then you're worse than not participating in it. You're undermining it. Something isn't supposed to be able to be undermined if it's clear and open and inviting of anybody who's willing to participate in it. So I think that we need to also say, if I don't wear an orange t-shirt, I'm not a bad person. It's the same thing as I tell anyone who tells me that they're uncomfortable participating in something like a smudging ceremony, if they're participating in, nowadays we see, especially in Western Canada, a lot of civic functions will begin with some kind of inculturation moment or the involvement of an Indigenous ritual. If someone says, well, I'm not comfortable participating in it, I say, good, don't. Don't participate in things you don't understand, and things that you are not comfortable with, because that's disingenuous. It only looks like something that isn't actually true. And that's what I think we need to work on, is getting over looking like something or sounding like something if we don't even actually believe it.
Thanks for your thanks for answering my questions. I appreciate the conversation.
Well, thanks for asking.
Any closing comments, or are we good here?
No, I think I just want to say, let us work together in promoting actual reconciliation, which only comes by embracing the truth.